There are two kinds of silence. The first is the one you get in a library or a church, a heavy, respectful silence, thick with the ghosts of unspoken words. The second is the silence of the future. It's the whisper, quiet hum of 400 volts of refined lithium-ion potential, the sound of a car that breathes electricity instead of gasoline. That second silence was my new favorite sound. My Stallion E, a masterpiece of silicon and steel that looked like a spaceship someone had dared to put wheels on, was my pride and joy. It was more than a car. It was a statement that said, I like torque, I like technology, and I really, really hate stopping for gas on my way to work. I lived in Pleasant Valley Homes, a sprawling monument to suburban agreeableness where the houses were painted in 50 shades of beige, and the most exciting event of the year was the annual synchronized sprinkler test. Bringing the Stallion E here was like parking a TIE fighter in a field of Shetland ponies. To feed my glorious electric steed, I'd had a level 2 charger installed. It was a sleek, minimalist piece of hardware, a black and silver rectangle mounted discreetly to the side of my garage. To me, it was beautiful, a functional, elegant symbol of progress. To my neighbor across the street, Carol, it was apparently a declaration of war. I first noticed the surveillance a few days after the installation. I'd be admiring the clean lines of the charger, and I'd catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. It was the predator-like shimmer of a curtain twitching in her living room window. Carol was the HOA president, a title she wore with the grim determination of a warden overseeing a particularly unruly prison yard. She was the reason our mailboxes had to be precisely 42 inches from the ground, and why Mr. Henderson down the street got a violation notice for a non-regulation garden gnome. The gnome had been wearing a Speedo. Apparently, our community's established character was strictly PG. I tried to ignore it. Maybe she was just curious. Maybe she was an enthusiast of professional electrical installations. But then came the ambush. I was out on my lawn, giving my sad-looking hydrangeas a drink when her shadow fell over me. "Oh, hello, Jack," she said. Her voice had the forced cheerfulness of a flight attendant explaining a delay. "Hey, Carol, how's it going?" I said, keeping my eyes on a particularly stubborn weed. "It's going," she replied, a universe of meaning packed into those two words. "Getting settled in with your new toy?" She gestured vaguely towards the Stallion E, her lips pursed as if she'd just tasted sour milk. "The car? Yeah, she's a dream," I said, unable to keep the pride out of my voice. Silent, fast, cheaper than gas. It's the future. Yes, the future," she mused, looking not at the car, but at the charger on the wall. "It's just that thing on your garage. It's quite industrial, isn't it?" I straightened up. "It's a car charger, Carol." "Of course, I know what it is," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "It's just that it doesn't really fit the neighborhood's aesthetic, you know? A little cold, a little ugly." Ugly? She called my beautiful portal to the future ugly. I didn't know how to respond to that. It was like calling a dishwasher uninspired, or a microwave artistically void. It was a functional object. Its beauty was in its purpose. "Well," I finally managed, "it's not really for looking at. It's for charging." She gave a tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Everything is for looking at in Pleasant Valley, Jack. Everything." She turned and walked back across her perfectly manicured lawn, her posture as rigid and unyielding as a fence post. I stood there for a long moment, hose in hand, feeling a sense of dread creep over me. This was not going to end well. 3 days later, my fears were confirmed. Tucked inside my regulation height mailbox was a crisp, cream-colored envelope. The paper was so thick it felt like it could stop a bullet. The HOA logo was embossed at the top in a regal, flowing script. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Official notice of violation. The words stared up at me, printed in a severe all-caps font. It cited my property for a breach of Bylaw 7, Section F, unapproved exterior modification. My charger, it claimed, was aesthetically discordant with the community's established character and visually disruptive to the harmonious streetscape. I had 30 days to remedy the violation. And there, at the bottom, was the signature. A loopy, self-important scrawl that looked like a seismograph reading during an earthquake. Carol Peterson, President, Pleasant Valley HOA. The war had officially begun. She'd fired the first shot, a salvo of passive-aggressive paperwork. I looked from the letter to my sleek, futuristic charger, then across the street to her beige, perfectly symmetrical house. A defiant grin spread across my face. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought my charger was ugly. I was about to redefine the word for her. My first instinct was to go nuclear, to pave my lawn, paint my house neon green, and install a 10-foot-tall inflatable gorilla on my roof holding a sign that read, "Carol is a Philistine." But my engineering brain, the part of me that debugs code for a living, took over. I needed to approach this logically. I had to exhaust all reasonable options before escalating to DEFCON 1. I had to prove to the world, or at least to the 2 other people on the HOA board, that I was the rational one. So I prepared for the monthly HOA meeting, like a lawyer preparing for a Supreme Court case. I created a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not kidding. It had title slides, bullet points, and even some tasteful transitions. My first slide was titled, "A Proposal for Aesthetic Integration." I had high-resolution photos of my charger from various angles. I had 3D mock-ups, created in a design program I used for work, showing potential solutions. My masterpiece was a slide showcasing a tasteful wooden lattice box, designed to enclose the charger. In the mock-up, I'd even added flowering clematis vines weaving through the slats. It looked like something out of a home and garden magazine. It was classy, it was subtle. It was, I thought, completely and utterly unassailable. My final slide was a simple, friendly photo of my smiling face, with the words, "Seeking a neighborly solution," underneath. The meeting was held in Carol's garage. It wasn't your normal garage, filled with rusty tools and forgotten Nordic tracks. No, Carol's garage was an operating theater. The concrete floor was sealed with a gray epoxy so clean you could eat off it. Every rake, shovel, and wrench hung on a pegboard, its shape outlined in black marker, like a victim at a crime scene. The air was thick with the smell of Windex and quiet desperation. The board consisted of Carol, seated at a folding table like a general commanding a battle, and 2 hostages, members, named Gerald and Marge. Gerald was a retiree with a perpetually confused expression who seemed to be a world-renowned expert in the art of nodding. Marge was a sweet-looking woman who knitted her way through meetings, her clicking needles providing a tense, rhythmic soundtrack to the proceedings. "Our first item of new business," Carol announced, her voice echoing slightly in the sterile space, "is the violation at 112 Oak Street. Jack, the floor is yours." I stood up, laptop in hand, and connected it to the small projector she had set up. I was nervous but confident. Reason was on my side. "Thank you, Carol, board members," I began, clicking to my first slide. "I'm here tonight to address the notice I received regarding my electric car charger and to propose a few solutions that I believe will satisfy everyone." I walked them through it. I was eloquent. I was charming. I used words like synergy and collaborative aesthetics. Gerald nodded. Marge's needles clicked. Carol stared at the screen, her face an unreadable mask of beige fury. I got to my lattice box proposal. "As you can see," I said, gesturing to the image of the flower-adorned enclosure, "this would completely hide the unit from the street, blending it seamlessly with the existing garden bed. It's a win-win." I finished my presentation and looked at them, a hopeful smile on my face. "So, what do you think?" Carol let the silence hang in the air for a moment too long. "Thank you for that colorful presentation, Jack," she began, the word colorful sounding like an accusation. "However, your proposed lattice structure is not a viable solution." My smile faltered. "It's not? Why?" "Lattice work," she stated, as if reciting scripture, "is only approved for back patios and rear-facing privacy fences, as per Section C, Paragraph 4 of the Architectural Guidelines. We can't have it on the front-facing profile of a home, and the introduction of an invasive vine like clematis can damage the siding. We simply cannot set that precedent." I was stunned. "Precedent? It's a plant box. Okay, forget the vines. What about just the box?" "It would still be a lattice structure," she said flatly. I clicked to another slide, my backup plan. It showed a simple, solid cover, designed to look like a small utility cabinet, painted the exact Sherwin-Williams, subtle fawn color of my house trim. "All right, what about this then? A simple cover. It would be practically invisible." Carol sighed, a long, weary sound, as if I were a particularly slow child. "Jack, that would constitute a secondary attached structure. Any such structure, even a small one, requires a full architectural review by the committee. The deadline for this quarter's submissions was last Tuesday. The next review cycle is in 3 months. 3 months? I sputtered. The letter said I have 30 days to remedy the situation. That's correct, she said, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. I felt the blood rushing to my ears. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a stonewall. Every logical solution I offered was being parried by an obscure, ridiculous rule. This is insane, I said, my voice rising. It's a box! A tiny painted box! Gerald shifted uncomfortably. Marge's knitting speed increased. The rules are the rules, Carol said, her voice turning to ice. They exist to protect our property values and maintain the character of our community. What character? I almost shouted. The character of 1,000 identical houses all painted the same shade of boring? Carol's eyes narrowed. You have your warning. If the unapproved modification is not removed by the deadline, you will face daily fines of $50. She leaned forward, delivering the final, condescending blow. I suggest you just charge your vehicle inside your garage. It's the simplest solution. I stared at her, dumbfounded. And leave my garage door open all night? That's a direct violation of Section G, Paragraph 2, regarding home security and pest control, a rule you personally cited in last month's newsletter when Mr. Henderson left his open by accident. A brief flash of panic crossed her face before being replaced by a mask of cold indifference. You have 30 days, Jack. She tapped her pen on the table. Meeting adjourned. I packed up my laptop, my beautiful presentation now feeling like a monument to my own naivete. I had tried reason. I had tried diplomacy. I had offered compromises that would have made the United Nations proud. And I had been shut down by a petty tyrant wielding a 3-ring binder of nonsensical rules. As I walked out of that sterile garage and into the humid night air, I knew one thing for sure. The time for being a good neighbor was over. My PowerPoint days were done. If she wanted to play by the book, fine. I was about to find a chapter she never even knew existed. The week that followed was a dark one. I was adrift in a sea of impotent rage. Every time I plugged in my car, I could feel Carol's judgmental gaze boring into the back of my head from across the street. The sleek, beautiful Charger now felt like a scarlet letter pinned to my garage. I was an aesthetic deviant, a visual disruption to the harmonious streetscape. I spent my evenings hunched over my desk, the Pleasant Valley HOA bylaws spread out before me like the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was a 200-page document filled with arcane regulations about everything from the acceptable sheen of exterior paint to the maximum allowable height of a decorative mailbox post, 44 inches for the record. It was a masterpiece of micromanagement, a testament to the idea that if you give someone a little power, they'll build a bureaucratic empire around it. My nights were fueled by cheap whiskey and spite. I'd scroll through online forums for HOA horror stories, searching for inspiration, for some loophole, some clever trick someone else had used to fight back against their own neighborhood Napoleon. I found stories of people planting legally protected but hideous invasive weeds, of people painting their house a legally approved but nauseating shade of puce. It was also uninspired, so brutish. I needed something more elegant, something with style. It happened on a Thursday night. I was deep into my second glass of bourbon, mindlessly clicking through a website for vintage Americana. A friend of mine was restoring an old Ford Fairlane, and I was looking for period-correct hubcaps for his birthday. I clicked on a link for gas station memorabilia, and that's when I saw it. It was a picture of a fully restored 1950s Wayne 505 gas pump. It was magnificent. It was tall and proud, with elegant, sweeping lines and a gleaming cherry-red paint job. It had a big, beautiful glass globe on top, lit from within, bearing the logo of a long-dead gasoline company. The front had a clock-like face, with a single, delicate hand, and numbers that spun behind a glass window. It was a piece of art, a relic from a time of chrome, optimism, and leaded gasoline. I just stared at it, mesmerized. And then a thought, hazy at first, began to crystallize in my whiskey-soaked brain. I frantically pulled up the HOA bylaws on my other monitor, my fingers flying across the keyboard, searching for a specific section I'd skimmed over before. There it was. Section H, Lawn and Garden Decorations. My eyes scanned the text, my heart beginning to pound. The section was clearly written by a committee of people whose primary design inspirations were garden gnomes and plastic flamingos. It was a list of pre-approved decorative items. The list included, but was not limited to, bird baths, sundials, wagon wheels, sculptures of a non-abstract nature, and other such thematic ornaments of a historical or whimsical nature, provided they do not exceed 6 feet in height. Thematic ornaments of a historical or whimsical nature. The words seemed to glow on the screen. Carol's argument, her entire case against me, rested on one word: ugly. My Charger was ugly because it was modern, cold, and industrial. It didn't fit the character of the neighborhood, but this gas pump. It wasn't modern. It was historical. It wasn't cold. It was a warm, nostalgic piece of Americana. It wasn't just a functional object, it was a thematic ornament. It ticked every single box in her own stupid rulebook. What could be more thematic for a garage than a freaking gas pump? A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. The plan downloaded into my brain, fully formed, like a software update from the gods of petty revenge. I wouldn't just hide the Charger. I would transform it. I would gut the vintage pump, mount my ugly modern Charger inside its hollow shell, and run the charging cable out through a replica gas hose and nozzle. It would be fully functional. From the outside, It would look like a museum-quality restoration. But when I plugged it into my Stallion E, it would be pumping pure, unadulterated 21st century electricity. It was perfect. It was malicious compliance of the highest order. It was taking her absurd, subjective complaint about aesthetics and beating her over the head with it using her own vaguely written rules. I leaned back in my chair, the whiskey glass shaking slightly in my hand. A laugh escaped my lips, low at first, then building into a full-blown, cackling roar of maniacal glee that probably had my neighbors thinking I'd finally snapped. I probably had. But I didn't care. Carol wanted me to get rid of my ugly modern box. Fine, I was going to give her something beautiful, something historical, something so fantastically, wonderfully out of place that it would become a legend. She wanted a fight about aesthetics? I was about to bring a bazooka to a knife fight, and my bazooka was going to be cherry red. A plan this beautifully insane required more than just spite and a credit card. I'm a software guy. My idea of fabrication is dragging and dropping elements in a user interface. I could design the system, but I couldn't build the Trojan horse itself. I needed a craftsman, a warrior poet of welding, a grizzled veteran of the mechanical arts who would see the genius in my madness. I couldn't exactly post on Craigslist. Wanted someone to help me disguise a car charger as a gas pump to enrage my HOA president. That felt like a good way to end up on a watch list. So I opted for subtlety. I found a local online forum for makers, tinkerers, and amateur engineers and posted a vague request. Seeking creative metal fabricator for a unique electromechanical art installation. Project involves restoring a vintage item and integrating modern electronics. Discretion and a good sense of humor are a must. For a few days, I got replies from people who wanted to put LED lights on their mailboxes. Then, an email landed in my inbox with the subject line, "Your Weird Project." The body of the email was just 2 sentences. "I like weird. Let's talk. Frank." I met Frank at his workshop the next day. It was in a ramshackle industrial park on the edge of town, the kind of place where rules went to die. The building was a giant metal shed that looked like it had survived a hurricane. The inside was glorious chaos. It was the absolute opposite of Carol's sterile garage. Tools weren't hung on pegboards. They were piled on workbenches in a beautiful, functional mess. The air smelled of motor oil, ozone from a welder, and hot metal. It was the scent of creation. Frank looked exactly like I hoped he would. He was in his late 60s, with a magnificent gray beard stained slightly with what might have been grease or coffee. He wore a faded denim work shirt, and his hands were the gnarled, calloused hands of a man who had spent a lifetime bending steel to his will. "You're the art installation guy?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He wiped a hand on a rag and offered it to me. His handshake felt like grabbing a handful of wrenches. "Jack," I said, "and art might be a generous term for it." I spent the next 20 minutes laying out the entire saga. The Stallion E, the sleek Charger, the beige-obsessed Carol, the HOA meeting, the bylaws, the late-night whiskey, and finally, the gas pump epiphany. I showed him the photo of the Wayne 505 on my phone. Frank listened intently, not saying a word, just stroking his beard. His expression was impossible to read. I finished, feeling a little foolish, like I'd just confessed my ridiculous revenge fantasy to a complete stranger. He stared at the photo on my phone for a long moment. Then he looked at me. A slow, magnificent grin spread across his face, revealing a set of surprisingly white teeth. "Let me get this straight," he rumbled, the grin widening. "You want to take your newfangled space car charger, hide it inside a piece of pure, lead-slinging American history, all to stick it to your neighborhood Nazi?" "Essentially, yes," I said, a wave of relief washing over me. "Son," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder hard enough to realign my spine. "I'll do it for half price. This is the best damn thing I've heard all year. This ain't just a project. This is a public service." We were in business. For the next 2 hours, we were like two kids planning the ultimate treehouse. We huddled over a cluttered workbench, sketching designs on the back of a greasy invoice. The project grew more elaborate, more perfect, with every passing minute. "We can't just run the cable out," Frank declared. "We gotta get a proper vintage-style woven fabric hose. Make it look authentic." "And the numbers," I said, getting excited. "The old spinning dials where it showed the gallons and price, we can replace those with custom digital LED panels." "Hell yes!" Frank shouted, slamming his hand on the bench. "We'll make 'em show kilowatt hours delivered and the current amperage draw. It'll look retro, but it'll be a damn data screen." "What about the globe on top?" I asked. "Oh, that's the best part," he said, his eyes twinkling. "We'll wire it to the charger's control board. When the car's not connected, it's dark. The second you plug in, that baby lights up. A big, glowing beacon of beautiful, silent, spite-fueled electricity. It was going to be a masterpiece. Now we just needed a canvas." Frank knew a guy, who knew a guy, who knew a farmer 2 hours out in the country who supposedly had a bunch of old gas station junk rusting in a field. The following Saturday, we drove out there in Frank's beat-up Ford F-150, a truck that ran on what sounded like pure grit and determination. The farmer was a leathery old man who led us to a grove of trees behind his barn. And there it was. Not a Wayne, but something even better. A 1954 Gilbarco salesmaker. It was a rusted, dented shell of its former self, half swallowed by weeds. It had no globe, no hose, and a bird had made a nest inside its guts. It was perfect. "She's a beaut, ain't she?" the farmer said. "She's magnificent," Frank replied with the reverence of a historian discovering a lost tomb. We paid the man $200, and with a great deal of grunting, swearing, and leveraging, we wrestled the 300-pound iron carcass into the back of Frank's truck. On the ride back, as we rattled down the highway with our rusty prize, getting more than a few strange looks from other drivers, I felt a sense of profound joy. We weren't just two guys with a truck full of junk. We were a team. We were artists. And we were about to create our magnum opus. The first phase of Operation Trojan Pump was deceptively mundane. To give our masterpiece a proper stage, we needed a foundation. I hired a local concrete guy to come and pour a small, perfectly square 2-by-2-foot slab of reinforced concrete next to my driveway, right where the old gas pump would stand. It was a simple, boring job, but to Carol, it was the first trumpet blast of the apocalypse. The concrete truck had barely pulled away, leaving a patch of wet, gray potential on the edge of my lawn when she materialized at the property line. She didn't walk so much as glide across her lawn, her face a thundercloud of suspicion. "Jack," she said, her voice sharp. "What is that?" "It's a concrete pad, Carol," I replied, feigning innocence. "For a new lawn ornament." "A lawn ornament?" she scoffed, eyeing the slab as if it were a radioactive crater. "It looks like an industrial footing. What kind of ornament requires a reinforced concrete base?" "A very stable one," I said with a pleasant smile. "Wouldn't want it to tip over in the wind. HOA regulations and all that." Using her own logic against her felt delicious. She narrowed her eyes, clearly unconvinced, but with no specific rule to cite against a statue base, she was powerless. She retreated back to her beige fortress, but I knew she was watching, waiting. She didn't have to wait long. A week later, convinced I was building an unlicensed private fuel depot in a residential zone, a phrase she must have spent hours crafting, she called the city. This led to a visit from Dave, a man who wore his city code enforcement uniform with the enthusiasm of someone on their way to a root canal. He was tall, paunchy, and had the most profoundly tired eyes I had ever seen. He looked at the concrete slab, then at the complaint form in his hand, then back at the slab. "She's claiming you're installing an underground fuel tank," Dave sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Carol was standing on her porch, arms crossed, observing the official proceedings. "Dave," I said, "it's a 2-foot square of concrete. It's 6 inches thick. I'd be lucky to store a gallon of milk in a tank that size. I'm putting up a sculpture." Dave looked over at Carol. "Ma'am, he's poured a base for a garden statue. As long as the structure he puts on it isn't permanent and doesn't violate any zoning setbacks, he doesn't need a permit. There's no fuel tank here." "But what is it for?" Carol shrieked from across the street. I decided to have some fun. "It's an art piece, Dave," I said, loud enough for her to hear. "It's a postmodern commentary on the complex and often fraught transition from fossil fuels to sustainable energy. A juxtaposition of past and future." Dave stared at me, his weary expression unchanging. "Right, an art piece." He scribbled a note on his clipboard. "You're all clear. Please try not to juxtapose on me again for at least 6 months." He got in his truck and drove away, leaving Carol fuming on her porch. Round 1 went to me. The real work began in my garage. With the door open to the warm autumn air, Frank and I transformed into a well-oiled machine of restoration. He taught me how to use an angle grinder to strip away decades of rust, how to apply body filler to smooth out the dents, how to prep the surface for the perfect coat of paint. The garage was filled with the sounds of our labor. The shriek of the grinder, the hiss of the spray gun, the satisfying click of wrenches. These noises, of course, were the next front in Carol's war. Convinced the sounds of progress were actually the sounds of me constructing a pipe bomb or running a chop shop, she escalated. She called the police. I was fitting the custom LED panels into the pump's face when 2 police cruisers, lights off, rolled silently up to my driveway. 2 officers got out, both young, looking more bored than concerned. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity," the first officer said, his eyes scanning my garage. He saw the half-disassembled, brightly painted shell of the gas pump, the tools, the wiring. His gaze lingered on the scene, a slow-dawning comprehension on his face. Also something about dangerous materials and welding without a permit. Carol was watching again, of course, a shadowy figure in her window. "Officers," I said calmly, wiping my hands on a rag. "My name is Jack. This is my friend, Frank. And this," I gestured dramatically to our project, "is a 1954 Gilbarco gas pump that we are restoring." The second officer peered closer. "You restoring an old gas pump? Cool. My grandpa had one of these at his old garage." "It's not just a restoration," I said, unable to resist. I gave them the condensed version of the story. The HOA, the ugly charger, the malicious compliance. As I spoke, the first officer's stern expression began to crack. The second one put a hand over his mouth to stifle a laugh. "So, let me get this straight," Officer 1 said, fighting a grin. "Your HOA president, the lady who called us, told you your car charger was ugly." "So you're hiding it inside this old gas pump to get back at her?" Officer 2 finished, the laugh finally breaking free. "I am complying with the aesthetic requirements of the community bylaws in the most historically sensitive way I can," I recited, my face a mask of pure innocence. The officers looked at each other and just shook their heads, chuckling. They walked over to Carol's property line. I couldn't hear what they said, but it was a short conversation that involved a lot of exasperated gestures on their part. They got back in their cars and left. Before pulling away, Officer 2 gave me a thumbs up. That was the moment I knew I was going to win. Carol had brought in the city and the police, and both had effectively laughed in her face. She had no authority left to appeal to. All she could do now was watch. And she did. For the next 2 weeks, as we applied the gleaming red paint, polished the chrome trim to a mirror shine, and wired the final components, her curtains never stopped twitching. She was a spectator at the construction of her own defeat. The pump was almost ready. The stage was set for the grand finale. The day of the unveiling felt like a movie premiere. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was a perfect day for a public spectacle. Frank and I had finished the pump the night before, working late into the night, fueled by pizza and the giddy anticipation of what was to come. It was more beautiful than I had ever imagined. The cherry red paint was so deep you could swim in it. The polished chrome trim gleamed in the garage light. Frank had even sourced a perfect replica glass globe, which we'd adorned with a custom-made logo for my Stallion E, rendered in a classic 1950s script. It wasn't just a disguise. It was a work of art. We waited until Saturday afternoon, prime time for neighborhood activity. As we'd hoped, the moment we started wheeling the pump, which was shrouded dramatically under a heavy canvas tarp, out of the garage, a crowd began to form. Mr. Henderson, of Speedo-wearing gnome fame, was out trimming his hedges. The family next door was washing their minivan. A few kids on bikes skidded to a halt. Word spread quickly. This was the mysterious art installation that had brought code enforcement and the police to our quiet little street. The curiosity was palpable. And, of course, across the street stood Carol. She wasn't hiding behind her curtains today. She was standing on her front lawn, arms crossed, phone in hand, ready to document my final, glorious failure. Her face was a grim mask of certainty. She was sure that whatever was under that tarp was a blatant, fine-worthy violation, and she was going to be there to witness it. Frank and I carefully positioned the pump on its concrete slab. The fit was perfect. We bolted it down, the metallic sound of the ratchet echoing in the quiet afternoon. A small crowd of about 15 neighbors had gathered now, watching from a respectful distance. "You ready for this?" Frank whispered, a huge grin on his face. "Born ready," I whispered back. With the theatrical flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick, I grabbed a corner of the tarp. Frank grabbed the other. In one smooth, practiced motion, we yanked it off. There were audible gasps. A few people actually applauded. It was magnificent. The sun hit the polished chrome and the red paint, and the whole thing seemed to glow. It didn't look like a disguise or a joke. It looked like a museum piece, an artifact from a simpler, more stylish time that had been teleported onto my suburban lawn. "Whoa, that's awesome, Jack!" shouted Mr. Henderson. But the show wasn't over. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced to the small crowd, "the main event." I walked over to the pump, lifted the vintage-style nozzle from its cradle, and uncoiled the beautiful fabric-wrapped black cable. The crowd murmured in confusion. I walked to my Stallion E, popped open the charge port, and plugged the nozzle in. A satisfying thunk echoed across the lawns. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a soft hum, the glass globe on top of the pump lit up, glowing with a brilliant white light. A moment later, the custom LED displays, hidden behind the vintage-style faceplate, flickered to life. The top one read 00.01 kWh. The bottom one read, delivering 9.6 kilowatts. The crowd erupted. They got it. They understood the sheer, glorious audacity of what I had done. There was laughter, more applause, and a sea of camera phones came out to capture the moment. But my attention was focused on one person. Across the street, Carol's face had gone through a rapid series of transformations, from smug certainty to confusion to disbelief. and finally to pure, unadulterated rage. Her mask of calm superiority shattered into a million pieces. "What is that?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. She stormed across the street, her phone held out in front of her like a weapon. "You can't have that! That's a commercial gasoline pump! It's a fire hazard! It's dangerous! It's against every rule!" I stood by my creation, calm and serene. I held up the thick, 3-ring binder I'd been waiting to use. "Actually, Carol," I said, my voice carrying clearly over her tirade, "it's not a gasoline pump. It's a thematic lawn ornament of a historical nature, as per Section H of the bylaws you know so well." I opened the binder to the bookmarked page. "It's made of metal and glass, just like an approved bird bath. It's under the 6-foot height limit, and it's entirely electric. In fact, it's probably safer than that gas-powered leaf blower you use." She was sputtering, trying to form words, but only incoherent sounds of fury came out. She was so focused on me that she didn't notice Gerald, quiet, nodding, board member Gerald, had ambled over from his house. He walked right up to the pump, adjusted his glasses, and inspected it closely. He ran a hand over the smooth, red paint. He looked at the glowing globe and the digital display. He turned, not to me, but to the crowd of neighbors and the still sputtering Carol. "Well," he said in his quiet, deliberate voice, "I rather like it. Adds a bit of character." That was it. That was the kill shot. It wasn't my argument that defeated her. It was the quiet approval of one of her own lieutenants. The spell was broken. The neighbors, sensing the shift in power, grew bolder in their praise. Carol stood there, isolated and powerless, her face flushed crimson. She had lost. In front of the entire neighborhood, her reign of beige terror had come to a spectacular, cherry-red end. Defeated, she turned without another word and retreated back into her house, the screen door slamming shut behind her. In the weeks that followed the great unveiling, a new era of peace descended upon Pleasant Valley homes. The daily fines I had been threatened with never materialized. An email went out from the HOA a week later, announcing with curt formality that Carol Peterson had resigned from her position as president, effective immediately, for personal reasons. The new HOA president was Gerald, who won the emergency election by a landslide. His first act was to propose an amendment to simplify the architectural guidelines. It passed unanimously. The gas pump, my beautiful monument to malicious compliance, became an instant neighborhood landmark. At first, it was just a local curiosity. Then, after someone posted a picture of it on a community Facebook page, it went viral on a small scale. People from a few towns over would sometimes drive by slowly, pointing. A group of high school kids even used it as a backdrop for their prom photos, dressed in 1950s attire. It was a hit. Instead of being the neighborhood pariah, I had inadvertently become its heart. Neighbors who had previously only offered a polite wave now stopped by to chat while I was fueling up my Stallion E. They'd ask about the project, share their own stories of run-ins with Carol, and marvel at Frank's handiwork. The pump wasn't a symbol of defiance anymore. It was a conversation starter, a strange, beautiful thing that brought us all a little closer. Frank became a local hero, too, getting a handful of commissions for other creative installations. Tonight, I'm sitting on my front porch, a glass of good whiskey in my hand, a celebratory one this time. The sun has just set, and the sky is a deep, velvety purple. Across the street, Carol's house is dark. I heard she put it on the market last week. A soft white light spills across my lawn, and I look over at the source. My Stallion E is plugged in, drinking its silent meal of electrons from a gleaming, cherry-red piece of history. The globe on top of the pump is a warm, welcoming beacon in the twilight. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted to charge my car. But life, I've learned, is what happens when other people have plans for you. Sometimes, the only way to deal with an unreasonable person is with an unreasonable amount of creativity. You can't fight their logic because they don't have any. You have to step outside the box. Or, in my case, build a brand new, old-fashioned box and put the argument inside it. I raise my glass in a toast to Frank, to American ingenuity, and to the beautiful absurdity of it all. The future is electric, but as it turns out, sometimes it looks a whole lot better when it's disguised as the past.